As next speaker, we have Frank Termer from Bitkom. He's gonna present us the role of open source in Germany and latest results from the Open Source Monitor 2021.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you for the kind introduction to my talk, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the results of the Open Source Monitor today here. But before we start and before we jump in to the results of the Open Source Monitor, I want to do a little thought experiment with you here. Maybe close your eyes and just imagine for a few seconds we were to shut down all open source software used worldwide, even for a moment. What would happen then? I think you can imagine the internet would come to a standstill because infrastructures like web servers and data transmission protocols and our open source applications and didn't run anymore. Many of the large digital platforms too use open source software, at least in some core areas. It would not function there. Millions of open source smartphones would turn off because the operating system is open source. And even software found in millions of devices, such as graphic applications, video editing software, and many others, would shut down. And even if most people are not aware of it, our everyday digital lives would be impossible without open source software. So that open source has a great major impact on our lives today. But what is so special about open source? I think you know, a prevailing preconception is in this context that above all, it is free of charge, clear. However, it is barely about that anymore. Software created under an open source license can be used freely. Its source code is open to analysis and modification, and once modified, it can be shared with others. And this means that many different developers can work on the same project. People from different companies, scientific institutions, the public sector, but also interested and skilled private individuals. They can contribute their specific know-how, ideas and solutions provided by others. And particularly new technologies like AI or blockchain can be developed further at a high speed through open source projects. And so this is the question, what is the reason for us as an association to look further on open source and to make a study and survey about this topic? And yeah, for us, it's clear we need reliable basis in order to be able to convince policymakers to do better, to use technology in the right direction. And this is why we conducted the German market, because it wasn't there since years. We had nothing about open source status quo in Germany. So we did this study the first time in 2018, and we were able to continue the study for the first time in 2021. And thanks to all of these partners, you can see here on the slide, we were able to do this a lot more than in 2019. We could gain more and deeper insights into the open source market in Germany, and some of the most interesting ones I want to share with you today, and I'm looking forward to our Q&A discussion afterwards. So what was the main question in the center of the Open Source Monitor in 2021? We had 4 different corners and 4 areas, and we had following questions like, what is the attitude of companies toward open source software and which advantages themselves? Second one is, to what extent do companies in Germany use open source software and which resources do they deploy for managing open source software? Third part is, to what extent are companies actively involved in the development of open source? Do they cooperate on open source software projects with? And fourth, how do companies deal with compliance regarding open source? So for this study here, I just want to give some notes about the research design so that you can know where this all numbers come from. For the survey, we interviewed 1,152 companies in Germany or more, and they were selected to represent different company sizes and industries. And by stratifying this randomized sample, we made sure that companies from different size ranges and industries were represented in statistical analysis. And during the analysis, the statements of the survey respondents were weighted in a way that created a representative picture of all companies with 20 or more employees in Germany in accordance with their size. So as you can see here, the choice of sample structure made it possible to portray the specific industries as well. They include automotive, banking, insurance, transport and logistics, commerce, but also other industries and other services which we need to make this whole towards the whole German economy here. You can see that the smaller companies have a way higher weight and have more impact on the results than the bigger ones. And you can see other services have also higher impact results than the other industries here. To the results, and let's start with the attitude towards open source. So the first question we were here, we are looking at is how does the company in general feel about open source software? And first of all, gave a definition of what is meant by open source software, because we weren't sure that everyone knows what we are talking about, and it's very important to make things clear at first, to have all in mind what is open source software with our point of view and what we are talking about. So here on the right side, you can see our definition we used and we sent on the phone. And yeah, the results on the left side, you can see that we have 67% that are open-minded towards open source. Only 7% are critical and negative about it. And we have a quarter of all companies, 25%, who are undecided here. This is quite interesting if you else with 2019. And here, as you can see, the results differ quite a bit because, as I said, we questioned companies with 20 or more employees, but in 2019 we questioned companies only with 100 or more employees here. So there are different bases we compare with each other. So the numbers you can see for 2021 slightly differ from the all over results here. But when we compare the results with 2019, we have to have a look at only companies with 100 or more employees here. And as you can see, we have a little decrease in the group who says they are interested and open-minded. We have a small increase of the undecided, and we have some slight increase in critical and negative employees here. We don't know really where this differentiation comes from. Could be this only statistics here, but we can say, and I showed it in the first slide, we made this survey just before Log4Shell or Log4j appeared, so we cannot say it's therefore that decreased on this side. But we are very happy to always see 70% are interested and open-minded here. And this predominantly positive attitude of companies towards open source continues when we ask about its advantages. And as you can see, we ask from your point of view, what is the biggest advantage that speaks for the use of open source software in your company? The thing here is that we ask this as an open question. So it was not multiple choice, or we gave companies these results and they should say what they think about it. Mind in the first time when we had this question here. So it's quite interesting when we look at these areas here in the results. Out of 10 companies, so 82% with more employees stated the use of open source software has advantages as all for themselves, because only 14% said that there are no advantages at all. And by far the most frequently mentioned advantage of open source software is the saving of costs, clear, as there are no licensing fees. A quarter of companies stated that this is the biggest advantage after all. This is followed by numerous other reasons that differ only by a few percent, as you can see here. A total of 41% of companies mentioned openness and flexibility of open source as the biggest advantage. And this includes access to the source code and easy switching of providers and many others who come here in this part. A total of 9% mentioned advantages relating to security. 7% of companies value the high security through regular and frequent updates, and another 2% mentioned open source software high stability and its low error proneness. And additional 8% see the improved chances for cooperation and innovation through open source software as the main advantage here. So as you can see, there is not the only one advantage everyone is saying, but we have a broad range of different advantages people and companies saying here by the use of open source. On the other side, we also ask about the disadvantages here, and we made the same. So we stated this open questions, and companies should say what they first think about this question. From your point of view, what is the biggest disadvantage? This speaks against the use of open source in your company. And you can see numerous disadvantages here. They can be subdivided into the 6 categories of staff, uncertainty, IT security, supply or choice, costs, and the image. And like the advantages, the disadvantages are very broad here. 1/3 of the companies said see the greatest disadvantages of open source at the staff level. 14% cite a lack of skilled staff as the biggest disadvantage. That means a lack of experts within the company able to adjust and develop software to meet their individual needs. And in this context, the high expenditures for initial and advanced training, as well as a lack of training opportunities for relevant skilled workers, are also seen as a disadvantage. And 4% say that the lack of acceptance of open source software in the company is a big disadvantage. For just another 1/5 of companies, the development and use of open source yields diverse uncertainties. So 10% see the warranty situation and supplier liabilities as opaque. 5% cite legal uncertainties regarding licensing, and 3% see the future of open source software. Regarding the issues of IT security, the results show that the ambience with which the use of open source is viewed, while 9% cite security-related aspects as advantage of open source, also 9% see them as a disadvantage. This is quite interesting. And of those, 7% pointed towards general security aspects, and 2% bemoaned error pronouns. And only a small group is critical of the lack of certification here. So after all, you can see many points speak pro open source, some points speak against open source here. So let's have a deeper look at different aspects of using open source in a company. Let's first have a look at the open source software strategy here. And when we ask about an existing open source strategy, the share of companies that have a strategic approach to open source is significantly reduced. Every 4th company, so 25% here, only has an open source software strategy, but almost 3/4 of companies has no open source strategy at all. And this is quite interesting here. When we look into the different company sizes and samples there, we can say that large companies with 2,000 or more employees are a little less open-minded to open source than large companies with 500 or more employees. They have certainly a more strategic approach to open source, so maybe this is for Siemens as well, as you can see here. And we can differentiate the results to different areas where strategy can be found. So for use, we have 14%. For participation, we have also 14%. We will have a look, a deeper insight into these different sections later on. But 72% have no strategy at all. Quite interesting is when we have a look into different industries here. So you can see just some numbers with a circle here that banks and insurance has mainly a cross-domain strategy for use of open source, as well as the ICT sector. And they have also a cross-cutting strategy for participation, as well as the automotive sector. So we can say that automotive, banks, insurance, and the ICT sector are the leaders here when it's about strategy developing in companies. And as you can see on the right side, the public administration, they are the followers here. Only a few strategies are made there, and they have mainly individual things. So let's have a look deeper into the open source usage here. We stated also which of the following statement applies to the use of open source software in your company to make a differentiation between use, integrate, development of open source. And as you can see here, 7 out of 10 companies with 20 or more employees stated they deliberately use open source software in their companies. They are contrasted by a quarter of companies, 26%, that state that they do not use any open source software solution. And this is quite interesting because remember our thought experiment from the beginning, we said open source is everywhere. And if they say 26% we do not use open source software at all, I'm not quite sure if they get what open source is really about and where you can find open source software in your world. So I would say that is not the right answer. We do not use open source software, but maybe it should say we have no clue that we use open source software. We think we do not, but we do. And we will have a look in the next years how these numbers are developing. And as you can see on the right side, some companies or these companies who say they use open source, they have different targets with this. 52% use it, 25% do it with integration, and some, so 53% in all, they do development in open source software. So it's quite interesting how broad the range here is of companies who say actively they use it. Also, we have a look at the 26% who said we do not use any open source software. So we ask them, for what reasons do you not use any open source software in your company? And again, we can see here that security concerns are the top answer, where 75% out of this 26% said that's why we do not use open source software in our company. And the second one, we already saw this, a lack of know-how in the company is stated 53%, and lack of support 53% as well. So the know-how is missing. They do not know how to use it. They have no experts in their company who can deal with open source. So this is really a problem and concerns for us as well, where we can see there's more to do in the future to lower the security concerns, but also to have more experts available and to have more know-how in the companies. And as you can see, security is quite an interesting topic here at first. So the importance of IT security and error-free use of open source for companies is also reflected by the fact that 7 out of 10 companies surveyed that stated that they perform security checks on the open source components they use. Almost half of the companies perform regular manual checks, and additionally, 1/3 uses automated analysis tools to identify security vulnerabilities here. A smaller share of the companies relies on information from commercial open source software component providers, 14%, and irregular manual checks are 8% here. So, however, almost every 4th of the surveyed companies does not perform targeted security checks on the open source software components they use. So this is quite high, as we see here. If they say security is a main issue for us and maybe prevents us from using open source, when they use it, there are 23% who say we don't care about this. We do not checking the security issues here. We are not dealing with this. So this is quite a high number, we say, and also the high number of manual checks is very interesting, because we say open source software is everywhere, and we have complex supply chains in the software, and it's nearly impossible to do every check on a manual basis, because they stated before they have no experts or not enough know-how in their company of persons who can do security checks, but they do it regularly. So we would expect that we would find more automated analysis here, but yeah, as you can see, only 33% stated they do this. And just have a look into the different industries here with this question. And as you can see, yeah, banks, insurances have a quite high automation rate here with 47%, and mainly manual or regular basis checks were found in the commerce sector or in the public administration. And this is quite interesting to keep in mind when we come to other results later on, that there are differences between especially the public sector, the public administration, and all other industries in the German economy here. So let's have a look at the open source software application selection criteria. So we asked, how important are the following criteria when selecting open source software projects in your company? And yeah, as you can see, lack of license fees, number one, with 90% who say that is very important or rather important. But when selecting open source projects, issues of IT security also play a central role. The selection criteria you can see here, we have divided them into three categories: the legal environment, the reliability, and the compatibility, and the community as a third aspect here. And an additional central criterion is security indicators. So this is a very important criteria for more than half of those surveyed, so 55% who say very important, and 30% or some 85% overall importance. So for 8 out of 10 companies, the rights ownership plays an important role, as well as the capacity for integration with open source software solutions that are already in use. And 7 out of 10 companies report that the number of security partners, support partners, as well as the reputation of the community are very important criteria here. So it's rather complex to choose the right open source project. This is clear here. And as we can see, security is also a big issue to choose the right component and the right open source project. So when it comes to the open source deployment and collaboration, let's have a look. Here we ask the question, with which of the following partners does your company work conceptually and or implementing within the framework of open source together? And so we can say openness and collaboration are always important features of open source software and open source projects, which also applies to the collaborating with external partners. And only half of the surveyed companies, so 51%, say they work together with partners who support them in using open source software, while the other half uses open source software without external support. So this is quite interesting as well. And when we look into the different company sizes, we can say that the bigger companies, so the companies with more than 2,000 employees, they do not work with others together. 2/3 of them say we do it on our do not work with others together, and only a third, so 32%, says we work together with partners in this direction. And as you can see on the right side, companies that work on open source software projects together with partners, they frequently enlist system houses as partners, followed by managed service providers or consulting companies. So this is the top 3, and many others followed by this. So we have a broad range of different partners you can work together when using and dealing with open source software here. And as I can say here, interesting to look into the details of the industries with 20+ employees here, that you can see the public administration is leading this quite above 73%, say we do open source software with partners. Only 20% say no, we do no collaboration at all. So this is quite a big difference regarding the other industries, followed by transports and logistics with 65%. They say we do collaboration with partners in this area. So when you deal with partners and you use open source, this next is open source software participation. And why is this important for us? You can say open source software lives of the active participation of its users in developing and enhancing software. The basis of any successful open source software project is an active open source software community, which works on projects collaboratively. And more than half of the companies with 20 or more employees is actively involved in developing and enhancing open source software or allows its staff to do so. And this is a clear increase compared to the previous study we did in 2019, as you can see here. So we have the blue ones from 2021 and the black ones from 2019. And as you can see, in 2019, only every third company with more than 100 employees said that they was actively involved in developing or enhancing open source software. So this is a big shift we see here within 2 years, that the number of active participation is increasing, that only 40% say we do not participate in the development of further development of open source software. And this is quite good development here, and we are very excited to see how it's developing in the next years when we ask the same question then again. So let's come to the more funniest things when it's come to open source. I'll speak about open source compliance and open source policies we can see here. So as we mentioned in the beginning, software is only open source if users are free to execute it, read it, modify the source code, and pass it on in modified or unmodified form to others. And for this reason, open source software is not a legal vacuum. The essential freedoms of open source are partly bound to concrete duties and requirements, which are laid out in licenses. And non-compliance with licensing requirements can result in written warnings, cease and desist letters, and indemnities, which may cost companies dearly. So to prevent this from happening, companies that rely on open source should have appropriate open source compliance management in place. And the first compliance component could be an open source software policy. So we mean by this a written document containing guidelines and rules of open source conduct within the company. And an open source software policy is of this type should be standard reading for any company employee working with open source software. And as you can see here, there's a great need to catch up among companies that use open source, integrate it into their products or solutions, develop and enhance open source or participate in this, because only about every fifth company, so here that works with open source, has an open source software policy in place. And this is quite high, we see. In comparison to 2019, you can see, yeah, the numbers are getting quite better here, but it's very, very small numbers, very interesting for us, so that the majority of open source users have not defined any such codes of conduct in an open source policy here. And when we look to the policies, it's always interesting to have a look on the compliance process once have in place. So when it comes to the policy, the compliance processes in companies, the results differ strongly because more than doubling in the proportion compared to the open source software policy we see here. Almost half of the companies that use, integrate, develop, or enhance or participate in open source have compliance processes in place. For example, clearly defined and written standardized procedures they use or do when using open source in this here. And as you can see, always the numbers are getting better. We can see 52% say yes, there is a compliance process in place, and only 43% say no, there is no compliance process. And this is quite getting better since 2019. So really good development here, and it's the right way. Let's have a deeper look into compliance actions some companies use. So 89% say we use compliance action in different ways. They use allow and deny lists. They use license compatibility checks. They make audits of the software supply chain in regular form. They audit of copyleft licenses, etc. So when companies say they do deal with open source and they have compliance process in place, the actions are quite broad and in terms of use or integration, as you can see here. We had the same questions regarding the participation of open source or in open source projects we can see here. So within participations, the numbers are quite different, lower, but also high, as you can see here, broad range of actions as well. They're checking participation for confidential information. They use allow and deny lists, again, checking and guaranteeing license obligations. So even if companies participate actively in open source projects, they use quite a range of different actions to get compliance here in place. So we are just facing some final remarks here on the OpenChain standard or the ISO 5230. As you know, or maybe you know, the open source license compliance standard developed by OpenChain was published as international standard in late 2020. And half of the companies say, or that use, integrate, develop, or enhance it, they have heard of this OpenChain standard here. So they say, yes, we know about this. And on average, every third company, so 35%, reported being aware of the OpenChain standard, but not having attended to it in greater detail. So yeah, there's some potential here to go further on, that companies develop OpenChain standards here and use it for themselves. When we have a look at the large companies, so among the large companies with more than 2,000 employees, only 1/5 of the surveyed companies has not yet addressed the OpenChain standard. And every fifth large company, 20% say that they has already completed the standards implementation in this further on. So this is a topic more or less for the future. We can see where OpenChain is built. And here you can see also the different industries. And as we know, that automotive is very far, and transport and logistics again, who have heard of OpenChain, and they see a very high or rather high value added when using OpenChain. So quite interesting project and development here to get open source software supply chain getting better. So for the last couple of slides, I have some things for the public administration only. I said on different questions already, some things about the public administration. First questions we had, how does the company organization generally feel about open source? We said that the economy is quite open-minded and interested. And as you can see here, facing the public administration, they are rather undecided or more critical and negative than the economy does. So there's a lot of work to do for us as an association and other policymakers here to convince public administration and public policy to have a better feeling about open source in general. Also, when we look at the advantages, it's not quite surprising that public administration also looks on the cost savings. They look at access to the source code and to the openness. And there's also a bigger group that says there is no advantages at all when using open source. So some differences here in comparing economy and public administration. And the same you can see regarding the disadvantages. And also they say that there's a lack of specialists. Their high training and familiarization costs are quite high, and no disadvantages at all. So 50% here. So slightly different numbers regarding economy versus the public administration. Also, we will have a look here in the future how things develop. So This were just some highlights from our study report, and yeah, many more insights you can find on our webpage, where you can download the open source monitor, also in German or in English, as you like it. And so to sum things up, we can say that compared to the 2019 open source monitor, this year's survey report highlights that open source is a subject that has developed at a high level in the past few years. And having already gained great significance among many companies, open source has now reached other organizations too that hadn't previously been active in the open source community. And this development is expected to continue, I think, in the years to come. And a push for digital sovereignty is an important reason for this. And also open source is seen as a source of innovation and can help pushing the digital transformation of business and administration and the society at large forward, as well as to expand, optimize, and change existing solutions. And on the other hand, you saw that unfortunately that this development is joined by a negative trend that has been apparent for several years now. And I mean a lack of skilled professionals in the field of software development, digital transformation, and technology. And whether it is cloud computing or big data a few years ago, AI or blockchain nowadays, or in the future, maybe quantum computing or others, you can see innovation in these areas and their diffusion into companies and organizations cannot succeed without the know-how of professionals. And however, open source as a means of collaboration will be able to help overcome bottlenecks, make better use of knowledge, and open up new topics, especially for small and medium-sized companies. So presently and in the future, I think we will be faced with more challenges. You can see the climate change today. We have challenges in health, in mobility, in energy, security, to name just a few. And I think we should make active use of the opportunities and potential of open source in general and of open source software in particular to meet these challenges. And we should be mindful of its essence, working together, jointly developing strategies and solutions, but also learning from each other and learning more about each other while overcoming horizontal and vertical boundaries. And this, I wish you for your conference today, Open Source at Siemens, that you will work together, that you will learn from each other, and that you have nice talks this day on. And yeah, I want to say thank you a lot for your patience, and I'm looking forward to your questions you may have and for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a question regarding open source use from slide 15. So there was a question about adoptions to open source software. Do you have a clear picture on how many people do keep those adoptions in-house versus contributing them to the open source projects?
We do not have quite this detailed information about this here. If this adapting the source code stays within the company or if they give it away, this is only the use. Yeah. No, I think we have no detailed answer to this if they contribute this adapting source code to the community or if it stays inside the company. Sorry about that.
What's your personal feeling about it?
Yeah, when we talk to companies who say they are active members in the open source community, their approach is to give it something back, to help the community. They feel some part of the community itself, and therefore it's more or less yeah, that they say it's normal for us to give something back to the community. So I would say that the main companies give it back to the community and do not close it and use it for themselves only.
Thanks. There's another question regarding the open source collaboration. We've seen there the highest number was within public administration where they collaborate with open source projects. Is this because kind of open source strategy from German government that is pushed to the public administration, or
Yeah, I think we can see different developments here in the public administration. As I said, the part of digital sovereignty is a very important thing developing in the past years. And as you may have known, open source is a main action they see to gain this digital sovereignty. So there's really an active community within the public administration dealing with open source. There are some organizations that they want to build up, just to say the Sovereign Tech Fund or the Zentrum für digitale Souveränität, ZENDIS, just to mention a few. And they need help. That's really clear. They do not have the expertise and the know-how on board and the persons to deal on their own with open source. So they need help, and they say here we need to collaborate with others. We need some partners who can help us become faster again in using software and technology and open source, especially here. So I think, yeah, it's the only way for the public administration to speed up and to gain those expertise and know-how they have a lack of. So this is really normal. I would say that public administration is here leading this question.
Thanks a lot. I have another question here. Do you have any recommendations regarding the role of inner source compared to open source? Would you recommend inner source as learning tool or more focused on certain areas like horizontal IT?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we did not ask about inner source here because we had to keep the questionnaire rather small. As we said, we had telephone interviews. They have around 20 minutes, so we couldn't integrate questions about inner source here. But I would say inner source is a great methodology to get in touch with the open source mindset and to really help making open source normal within the company, to reach everyone dealing with software and technology, to be open-minded, to work together. So I would say yes, it's a great opportunity to use inside the company, to have a feeling what does it mean to work together, what does it mean to share results and to give it to others. So yeah, inner source I would say is a very important part to gain digital transformation, to reach best results here.
Thanks a lot. Do we have any further question here? No. Sorry. Just saw it right now. What do you think are the main reasons that the administration shows such a resistance to open source software?
I think it's fear, as always, when people do not know good enough about any topic, they have fear about it, and they see, yeah, it's when you talk to some members from the public administration, they have some weird concepts in their mind what open source software mean. They think it's this nerds sitting in the cellar with long hair and coding for themselves, and now they should use software. Yeah, that's all this stupid and myths they see. And so we have many things to do to make a better and professional picture of open source software, what it is today, so that you can have open source from professional partners. That open source is a quality or a high quality product as well. And I think we have many things to talk about with the public administration here to get out with this old and stupid myths they have, and they have to learn that open source software is nothing nerdy anymore, or longer ago. So open source software is a real big game changer and is an opportunity for themselves.
So I just wanted to follow up on that question. Is I can only compare the market I know is the Spanish one, and with the administration, and in that case, my feeling is that there's only two ways to interact, or let's say to develop when you are in the administration. Is either you go through this kind of opposition, so you have to get the position in the administration and does not go into the young, healthy, like more university oriented, that kind of that, or that you are part of a big consultant company, because that's what the administration does. So basically, give this. So, is there a way to improve that, or let's say, there's ideas on how to make that better, or how does it work in the rest of Europe?
I think what the public administration has to learn, that they can be a part of the open source communities out there. They still think open source is some place which has nothing to do with themselves, and they want to do it on their own. They want to keep results for themselves, but I think they have to learn and to understand that open source means collaborating, working together with other companies from outside the public administration, that there is no reason to hide results or to be ashamed from what you are doing here. And I think this is some kind of mindset thing that have to change there. And as I said, we hope that some consulting companies, some partners they work together with, will help them to make this organizational change, as you see. And maybe it will take some years to go that this change will happen, but we are quite optimistic, because they say open source is quite rather important. If you look into the 9 points plan of the Bundes-CIO Markus Richter, open source plays an incredible important role there. As I said, they want to build some organizations to help getting open source better here. So I would say yes, it's a mindset thing, and we all have to help them dealing with this, and to make it comfortable, and to get positive attitude towards this.
So we would have time for one more question in the room here. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've mentioned this already, but could you elaborate on the roles that were surveyed in this questionnaire, in the interviews here?
Yeah. So I have no slide with this, but the first question when we called up the companies there is that we said we wanted to speak with the person who is responsible for open source in the company. We had, I think, 2 or 3% of all companies who said, yeah, there is some role defined which has open source within the title, so head of open source or something like this. But there was no person available with this title. We asked, okay, so who is responsible for software or open source in the company? And I would say about 70% it was the CTO or the Chief Information Officer in the company. So mainly we talked with the main leading person for software and technology within the company.
Thank you very, very much, Frank, for joining us and answering all the questions. I'm pretty sure we will be able to discuss for many, many longer times about those that important topic. And thank you for pushing that topic, open source. And thanks a lot for having for being with us.